There's a moment most of us have experienced. You're in a conversation, maybe at a dinner table, maybe in a meeting, maybe online, and someone says something you know is wrong. Your chest tightens, your mind races to form the perfect counter-argument. You feel a pull, almost physical, to correct them, to win. And yet, if you think back to the wisest people you've ever known, the ones who seemed truly, deeply intelligent, you'll notice something strange. They rarely argued. They didn't take every bait. They didn't raise their voice to prove a point. They listened more than they spoke. And when they did speak, what they said landed differently. It carried weight. Today we're going to explore why that is. We're going to look at what psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy have to say about the relationship between wisdom, intelligence, and the impulse to argue. And more than that, we're going to understand how the most intelligent minds in history and in our everyday lives have learned to resist one of the deepest urges the human brain possesses, the urge to be right. Let's begin. The ego and the argument. The first thing we need to understand is why we argue in the first place. And the honest answer is, most of the time, it has nothing to do with truth. When psychologists study conflict in conversation, they find a consistent pattern. Arguments rarely begin as genuine searches for understanding. They begin as ego events. Someone says something that threatens our sense of self, our intelligence, our values, our identity, and the brain responds as though it were under physical attack. The amygdala, that ancient alarm system in the brain, doesn't distinguish between a threat to your body and a threat to your beliefs. When your worldview is challenged, you get a stress response. Cortisol rises. Rational thinking narrows. You shift from a curious open state into a defensive one. This is what researchers call psychological reactance, the mind's way of pushing back when it feels its freedom or identity is being constrained. And once you're in that reactive state, you're no longer arguing about the topic. You're arguing to protect yourself. Think about the last argument you had. Was it really about the facts? Or was it about feeling heard, feeling respected, feeling right? This is the first insight wisdom gives us. Most arguments are not about the subject matter. They are about ego. And the truly intelligent person recognizes this early and refuses to play that game. There's a concept in Stoic philosophy called the dichotomy of control, the idea that there are things within our power and things outside of it. Other people's opinions fall into the second category. You cannot force someone to believe what you believe. You cannot out-logic someone into changing their values. And if you try, you usually make them hold those beliefs more tightly, not less. Psychologists call this the backfire effect. When people are confronted with strong evidence against a deeply held belief, they don't update the belief, they double down. The argument doesn't change minds, it calcifies them. The wise person understands this, and so they don't argue, not because they don't care about truth, but because they understand that argument is often the least effective path to it. What intelligence actually looks like: we have a cultural image of intelligence that's deeply mistaken. We tend to imagine intelligent people as quick, sharp, ready with a comeback, debate champions. People who can dismantle an argument in seconds. People who always know the answer. But this image confuses intelligence with performance. Real intelligence, the deep, generative kind, looks very different. It looks like pausing before responding. It looks like asking questions instead of making statements. It looks like changing your mind when the evidence warrants it, without shame or defensiveness. Psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades studying what she called the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. People with fixed mindsets believe intelligence is a static trait, something you either have or don't. And because of that belief, they become terrified of being wrong. Because being wrong feels like proof that they're not intelligent. People with growth mindsets, on the other hand, see understanding as something that develops. Being wrong is just information. It's data. It's an opportunity. Now ask yourself, which person is more likely to argue? Which person is more threatened by a contrary opinion? It's the fixed mindset person every time, because for them, the argument is existential. Losing the argument means something about who they are. But here's the paradox. The person who is always trying to prove their intelligence is usually the one who learns the least. And the person who seems unbothered by being wrong is often the one whose intelligence actually grows over time. Socrates understood this more than 2,000 years ago. His whole method, what we now call the Socratic method, was built around the idea that wisdom begins with admitting what you don't know. He famously said that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing, and yet he was considered the wisest man in Athens. That's not false modesty. That's a profound psychological insight. The person who knows they don't know everything is always curious, and curiosity is the engine of genuine intelligence. The person who already believes they know who needs to defend that knowledge and argument has, in a very real sense, stopped growing. There's another dimension here worth exploring. Truly intelligent people tend to score high in what psychologists call intellectual humility, the ability to recognize the limits of your own knowledge, to hold your beliefs with appropriate uncertainty, and to remain genuinely open to revision. Studies consistently show that people with high intellectual humility perform better on reasoning tasks, make better decisions, and build stronger relationships. They are, in measurable ways, better thinkers. Not because they're smarter in the raw sense, but because they've stopped wasting energy defending a position and started spending that energy understanding the world more accurately. The neuroscience of being right. Let's talk about the brain for a moment, because what's happening neurologically when we argue is fascinating and a little disturbing. When you win an argument, when you feel you've successfully defeated someone's point, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical released when you eat something delicious, when you hear a song you love, when you win at a game. In other words, being right feels good, and the brain wants to feel good again. So it starts seeking out opportunities to be right. It becomes addicted, in a very mild but real sense, to the experience of winning arguments. This is why some people seem to argue about everything. It's not because every topic genuinely matters to them. It's because the neurological reward of winning has become something they chase, often unconsciously. Now layer on top of that the negativity bias, the brain's tendency to weight threats and losses more heavily than gains and rewards. Feeling wrong, being corrected, being challenged, these register as losses, and the brain fights hard to avoid losses. So you have a system that actively rewards winning and actively punishes feeling wrong, and it operates mostly below the level of conscious awareness. You think you're having a rational debate about policy or facts or values. But underneath, your brain is running a deeply emotional script about safety, status, and survival. The wise person has done the work, sometimes through years of reflection, meditation, therapy, or simply paying attention to see this script for what it is. They've learned to feel the pull of the argument and choose not to follow it. There's a word in Buddhism for this: equanimity, the quality of mental calmness, composure, and evenness of temper, especially in difficult situations. Equanimity isn't indifference. It's not that you don't care. It's that you have a stable enough inner foundation that you don't need the external wind to feel okay. The person with equanimity can hear something that challenges them and stay curious rather than defensive. They can sit in the discomfort of uncertainty. They can say, "I don't know," or "you might be right," without feeling that their entire self-worth has been threatened. That psychological stability, that's not weakness. That's one of the highest forms of strength the human mind is capable of. The wisdom of silence. There's an old proverb, and versions of it appear in almost every culture, that says something like, "It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." Now, I don't think the point is to stay silent because you might be wrong. The deeper point is about the quality of attention and restraint that characterizes wisdom. In many indigenous cultures, the elders don't speak first. They listen deeply, completely, before offering a perspective. Not because they don't have one, but because they understand that speaking before you've truly understood the situation is almost always a mistake. In Japanese culture, there's a concept called ma, the meaningful pause, the space between words. It's considered a mark of sophistication and depth to be comfortable in silence, to not feel compelled to fill every gap with noise. And yet in many modern contexts, especially in the West, silence is misread as weakness or uncertainty. We reward the quick answer, the fast talker, the person who always has something to say. But think about it from the other side. When you encounter someone who doesn't rush to speak, who seems genuinely comfortable pausing, who asks a clarifying question before responding, don't you almost immediately sense that there's something different about them? A kind of groundedness? That groundedness is wisdom in action. Here's the practical psychology of it. When you don't respond immediately to a challenge, two things happen. First, you buy yourself time to think clearly, rather than react emotionally. Second, you signal to the other person that you're not threatened by what they said, which, ironically, gives you far more authority in the conversation than any clever comeback would. Silence, used well, isn't passive. It's one of the most powerful communicative choices you can make, and this brings us to a key distinction: the difference between someone who doesn't argue because they don't care, and someone who doesn't argue because they've transcended the need to win. The first is apathy. The second is mastery. The art of understanding versus the urge to win. Here's a question worth sitting with. When you enter a difficult conversation, what is your actual goal? If you're honest, you might notice that your stated goal to find truth, to resolve a disagreement, to help someone understand is often quite different from your felt goal, which is to win, to be validated, to not feel foolish. The truly intelligent person has brought these two goals into alignment. For them, understanding actually is the goal, not performing understanding actually achieving it. This requires a particular kind of courage, because it means you have to be willing to be changed by the conversation. You have to hold your position loosely enough that new information can get through. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, whose work on thinking and decision-making reshaped our understanding of the mind, distinguished between what he called System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, and largely emotional. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful, and logical. Arguing in the heat of the moment is almost entirely a System 1 activity. You're running on instinct, on ego, on the reflex to defend. The conclusions you reach in that state are not your clearest thinking. They're your most defensive thinking. Genuinely wise engagement requires shifting into System 2, and that shift requires a pause. It requires the willingness to slow down when your brain is screaming at you to speed up. One of the most powerful tools for this is something simple that the best listeners and negotiators do. They try to understand before they try to respond. They ask themselves before they say anything, do I actually understand what this person is saying? Do I understand why they believe it? Not, what's wrong with their argument? Not, how do I counter this? But genuinely, where is this person coming from? This isn't just a technique, it's a philosophical orientation. It's the difference between seeing the other person as an opponent and seeing them as a fellow human being who has arrived at a different understanding of the world for reasons that make sense to them. When you make that shift, something remarkable happens. The argument dissolves, not because you've won, but because you've stopped fighting and started understanding. And understanding, real understanding, almost always finds more common ground than any argument ever could. When wise people do speak now, I want to be careful here, because none of this is an argument for passivity. The wise don't stay silent because they have nothing to say or because they're afraid of conflict. They speak when speaking serves something greater than ego. There's a profound difference between arguing and advocating. Arguing is about winning. Advocating at its best is about illuminating. It's about contributing something to the shared understanding of a situation. The wise person speaks when they have something to say that genuinely adds to the conversation. They speak up against injustice, clearly and firmly, without the shakiness of ego-driven anger. They share perspectives that challenge assumptions, but they do it with an openness that invites dialogue rather than cutting it off. They know how to disagree without being disagreeable. They know how to hold a position without needing to crush the opposition. They know how to plant a seed of an idea and trust that the other person might water it on their own terms, in their own time. This is the essence of what philosophers call dialectic at its best, not a battle, but a collaborative search. Two minds or more, trying together to get closer to something true. And when the wise person does speak in a difficult conversation, notice what they don't do. They don't say, "You're wrong." They might say, "I see it differently." They don't say, "That makes no sense." They might say, "Help me understand how you arrived at that." They don't belittle. They don't mock. They don't use the conversation as an opportunity to establish dominance, because they're not trying to win. They're trying to understand, and occasionally to be understood. Building the wisdom habit. So how do you actually develop this quality? Because knowing that wise people don't argue is one thing. Actually becoming someone who doesn't argue is quite another. The habit of argument is often deeply ingrained. It's social, it's psychological, it's neurological. Here are some concrete practices drawn from psychology and contemplative tradition that can genuinely help. The first practice is noticing the trigger. Before you can change a pattern, you have to be able to see it. Start paying attention to the exact moment you feel the urge to argue arises. What does it feel like in your body? Where does it live in your chest, your throat, your jaw? Just developing awareness of that trigger sensation, without immediately acting on it, is the first step. The second practice is the one-breath pause. When you feel that trigger, take one conscious breath before you respond, just one. That single breath shifts you from reactive to responsive. It gives System 2 a moment to come online. It's small, but it is genuinely transformative in practice. The third practice is the question instead of the counter. Train yourself to ask a question before you make a counter-argument, not a leading question designed to trap a genuine question. What makes you say that? Or, can you tell me more about that? This does two things. It gives you more information, which makes your eventual response better informed, and it signals to the other person that you're actually listening, which changes the entire tone of the exchange. The fourth practice is examining your investment. Ask yourself honestly, why does it matter to me that this person agrees with me? Sometimes the answer is genuinely principled justice, truth, real consequences. More often, the answer has something to do with ego, with wanting to feel smart, with not wanting to feel disrespected. When you see it honestly, you can make a more deliberate choice about how much energy to put in. The fifth practice is learning to love being wrong. This sounds strange, but try to cultivate genuine curiosity about your own mistakes and blind spots. Being corrected means you now know something you didn't know before. That's the best possible outcome of any conversation. When you start experiencing being wrong as a gift rather than a loss, the fear of argument diminishes enormously. You stop defending and start discovering. Let me bring this back to where we started. The wisest people you've known, whether a grandparent, a mentor, a teacher, or someone you've read about, shared something in common. There was a quality to them that felt different from the fast, loud, always ready with an answer intelligence we often admire. They didn't need to prove themselves in the moment. They didn't rise to every challenge. They didn't fill every silence. And yet their words, when they came, carried weight. Their presence in a room shifted something. Their influence lasted long after the conversation ended. That quality has a name. It's wisdom. And wisdom is not the absence of intelligence. It's intelligence that has been seasoned by experience, humility, and a deep understanding of what actually matters. What actually matters is not who wins the argument. What matters is whether we understand each other a little better than we did before. Whether we've moved even slightly closer to something true. Whether we leave the other person feeling seen and respected, not defeated and humiliated. The most powerful conversations in history were not the ones where someone was crushed by a superior argument. They were the ones where someone was genuinely heard, for perhaps the first time, and changed from the inside out. That's the kind of conversation that only wisdom makes possible. So the next time you feel that pull, that tightening in the chest, that readiness to fight, pause, notice it. Ask yourself what you're actually defending. And ask yourself whether the wiser path might be not to argue but to understand, because the truly intelligent don't argue. They listen, they question, they consider, and they trust that truth over time takes care of itself. Thank you.